and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall. This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is City Hall.
Well, good morning everyone, and can I thank you all for attending this morning. And before we start, can I just remind everyone to please turn their mobile phones either off or to silent. And can I start with item 1 and asking Camelia Thomas, our committee officer, if there are any apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. We've received an apology from Caroline Pigeon, and we've also received an apology from John Biggs, for whom Tom Copley is substituting this morning, and Len Duval will be arriving shortly.
Okay, thank you, and thanks Tom for attending this morning. Then can I move to item 2, declarations of interest? Can we note the declarations of interest set out in our report? And can I ask members to declare any other interests now? No. Thank you. Can I ask members to confirm the minutes of the Stop and Search Working Group on the 4th of September? Agreed? Agreed. Thank you. And can we now move to our main item this morning, which is to look at the management of the Metropolitan Police Service's custody suites and the provision of healthcare to detainees. And can I thank our first round of guests this morning, and can I say we are having this meeting in two parts. We're having extra guests coming in for our second session, but perhaps I can start with Marie. Marie, would you kindly just introduce yourself and what position you have, and then we'll go round.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Marie Snelling. I'm the new Director for Integrated Offender Management Programmes and Neighbourhoods at MOPAC. This is my third week in the role, and within that I've been invited this morning to be part of the discussions in terms of the oversight in terms of custody.
Thank you. Morning, Chair. Adrian Hansdott. I'm the Commander in Territorial Policing. I've got the portfolio for crime and criminal justice, which includes detention. There's going to be a theme of new interest in this area because I've only been in this portfolio for about 7 weeks. But it's helpful to have a new look at it, I guess, in that respect.
I think you've brought the expert next door, is that right?
Good morning, I'm Superintendent Annette Whiteman. I am the old head of the Custody Directorate, which is part of Territorial Policing Criminal Justice Operational Command Unit.
You mean former head, don't you?
I hope not.
Oh, I haven't said
You obviously know more than I do, sir.
No, you said old.
No, as in they're new, I'm old.
Oh, I see.
Well, there we go. Well, let me start the formal questions, if I can.
Chair,
yes,
would
Roger.
it be useful if Ms Snelling told us a little bit about her background, because that is something that
Yes.
we were wondering about
Yep.
in the pre-meeting as a new appointment?
Yes, of course, no problem. I've joined MOPAC from working most recently as the Portfolio Director for the Tri-Borough Authorities, so Kensington, Chelsea, Westminster and Hammersmith and Fulham, whereas overseeing the overall portfolio of change there in terms of combination of services and also leading around public service reform proposals as well.
So you're a change management expert?
Yes, absolutely, and come from very much working on the local level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps then I could start the formal questions. And we know that new arrangements for MPS custody suites were implemented in around July this year, and from those of us that were on the MPA, we're aware that there were two reasons for that. One was costs, and the second was hopefully to improve the level of service and the quality and rapidness at which detainees would see a health professional. But we understand that with those new arrangements, concerns were expressed by the Federation in particular about the safety of some of those practices, and that the Health and Safety Executive are currently looking at this issue and have provided an interim report, we understand. So perhaps if I could just ask some general questions around risk, and then other members will drill down a little more into some of the detail. So, Adrian, can I just ask you to start with, is what do you think has happened in terms of risk in custody since the new arrangements have been implemented?
I think the first thing, obviously, to talk about is, as you say, why we've done this. It's part of the broader change to the Met and the local policing model to try and bring some sense of ownership to some key areas of business, and custody is a particular risk area for us for two reasons. One, it's about the health, safety and welfare of the people that we have detained and making sure that that's correct. And then secondly, we shouldn't forget it's an investigative arena. We need to ensure that we're doing the right, the right things for victims who've asked us to investigate their crimes. Without going into, if you like, some of the speculation as to why the health and safety get involved, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, maybe I can just outline what we've put in place to actually provide a stronger governance framework around all of the issues in custody. So, if you think at the national level, we are very much governed by HMI prisons around how we develop, how we actually create the custody environment. So there's a whole set of regulations around that. Internally, we've undertaken a number of significant inspection and review processes on a continual basis to understand where there may be risk areas and where there's compliance issues with some of the expectations that are set nationally. And then at the borough level, there's an obligation on borough commanders to understand and check for risk aspects, and I'll come into some of the detail as we go on. The final checkpoint is then through external scrutiny, through independent custody visitors and the challenge panels that we receive locally. Since 2011, we've been running what's previously been described as Operation INCAN, but is now part of our custody improvement programme, which looks at a whole range of issues that come out of our gold groups following an incident in custody, be it a death that fortunately we've not had in London for over 4 years, but to look at themes and opportunities that we may need to address them. And in short, they boil down to 8 areas. Would you like me to just outline the 8 key areas that we think cause risk? Just very briefly, so the first thing is the supervision and audit of people and issues in custody. Secondly, it's the risk assessments that are undertaken. Third, it's our attention to those who have come in with either drunk or suffering through drugs and issues, mental health. It's in relation to the way that we then rouse them and check that they are healthy and safe. Fourth, it's around the cell environment, full stop. Fifth, risk assessments and release assessments before we hand them into the care or custody of somebody else. Handovers full stop between different custody teams. Seventh is the constant supervision. How do we look after people who we know present a particular concern to us and may be at risk of harm? And then finally, it's around ensuring we've got the right first aid capability and capability to respond to emergencies in custody. So, for example, have we got ligature cutters? Have we got key security? And all of the practicalities that ensure safety. I'll wait to see where you want me to go, because there's a lot of detail around the regimes that check for all of these. But the overwhelming point of custody for us is it is a place of high risk, and there's an obligation on a number of people throughout the chain of responsibility in the service to look out for that risk, be it the custody officer on initial reception, detention officers throughout their care, investigating officers as they unpick the case, and then custody managers and borough commanders around looking at the governance of the whole environment.
Quite a few of those risks we'll be looking at as we go forward, but can I ask you, generally in terms of risk, I mean, those of us that were on the NPA will know that you have a risk register in the NPS. Can I ask, has the custody provision actually risen on that risk register, or has it decreased? Or
well, it sits there as a standard item because it always presents a risk. It's not something that's ever really going to fall off, because there's so many factors with the 260,000 people who we arrest every year and are in custody. Each one of them presents its own particular risk. And with the changes to legislation, to the way that we work, new recommendations coming out of a whole range of bodies, that's always a risk if we don't manage those effectively. So it will always stay on there as a standing item, I guess, is the position.
I suppose the question I'm really asking is, since you introduced your new arrangements, has any aspects of risk increased?
No. In fact, if you look at some of the key areas, the fundamental point of, I think, the HSE investigation is how we've introduced the inspector role into custody to provide greater safeguards around times in detention and looking out for this. So if we talk about what happened before July, we had 47 dedicated custody inspectors, 32 of them, one per borough, were a permanent custody manager, and there were 15 additional permanent PACE inspectors in a number of boroughs. Since July, recognising what we need to do to manage all of those issues I've described, we now have 88 inspector posts that are permanently dedicated to looking into custody, detention regulations and safety and risk factors. So we almost doubled the amount of inspector supervision to manage those factors for us.
Okay. Can I ask, with regards to the health and safety executive's investigation, can I ask, were you fully supportive of them coming in, and can you let us know exactly what specific areas did they highlight in their interim report to you?
Well, we haven't had an interim report.
You haven't?
We were due to meet with them, and I had a session planned with them actually for next week. That has been stood down at the moment because they're still working now on another aspect which they haven't revealed to us what that is. We've cooperated throughout. They've been to look at custody suites. As with anything, we're quite keen to see what the recommendations are, because if there's something that we're already missing, something so fundamental, then we're very, very keen to see it. It shouldn't be a surprise, any of these things. We've invested enormously in internal inspections. We've had a number of external HMIP inspections that have given some quite positive feedback, as well as some areas for us to consider. As I say, I really can't speculate really on what the HSE might say, because I've not had any interaction personally with them, and we've not had any formal notification as to what they've considered, other than them telling us the areas that they're interested in looking at.
Okay, I think it would be useful following this meeting that once you've had that, if you could let us know
Yes, of course,
the areas that are useful. Jenny?
I thought we all did know what the HSE was concerned about.
I'm aware of their, if you like, their terms of reference, but we haven't had any findings. I guess, I was expecting we would have had an interim report on what we might need to do in the short term, but we haven't had anything to suggest what we're already doing isn't on the right lines.
Okay, and HMIC has recommendations, a set of recommendations for custody suites, does it?
Yes, it does, yes.
And you complied with all of those recommendations?
Broadly, yes. I mean, we've had 5 inspections already this year, at Westminster, Havering, Barking, Dagenham, Camden and Barnet. We've not received, again, all their final reports yet. We've only received one formal report. But the hot debrief findings are generally positive. They're saying there's excellent oversight certainly in Barking and Dagenham. One of their quote is one of the best that they've seen in their inspections. Health services, primary care is good. Mental health is underdeveloped in some areas, which we understand and know is a gap, and there's work ongoing around liaison and diversion into health services, which is being led by one of my colleagues. So we do have some initial feedback from HMIT that are saying, yes, we are doing what they would expect to see in our custody environments.
Yes. Can I ask you, can you say a little bit more about why these new arrangements were considered necessary?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of it in a practical way, the key issue for us is custody is a busy environment, and how recently you've been down there, but it's the throughput of people that means to provide that personal attention to every individual is a tough job for custody officers and DDOs. The safeguard, I guess, for us, and the check has always been the inspector responsibility that assesses why a person is still in custody after 9 hours. Is that legitimate? Are we being expeditious in the way we investigate? Because clearly we only want to keep people for the shortest legitimate time possible. Where that had been confusing and challenging in the past, we were covering some of those responsibilities by asking the operational inspector to come and make those checks on our behalf, and also keep an eye on potential risks at the same time. They're busy, anybody who works in London knows an operational inspector is pretty much busy full-time anyway, dealing with any number of critical incidents 24 hours a day. So the service that the custody sergeants were receiving was probably patchy. The new arrangements provided dedicated capability, and certainly if we get a chance to talk about what we will be doing from next year when we have a single unique dedicated detention command, it brings all of that responsibility in-house to a dedicated role with more capability. The 88 inspectors now provide that full-time eyes in custody for these issues.
I thought you'd increase the number of inspectors by 14.
No, that's next year. So we're going to.
So it's just 8 at the moment. Is that really enough for all the face-to-face interviews you have to do?
Yes, indeed, because it's a dedicated role now. We were doing this before, just with our operational inspectors. This is now a dedicated post for both our custody, permanent custody managers and these, what we could almost describe as peripatetic custody support inspectors. So that's all they do in the main, excepting there's some other responsibilities around identifying risk. There's still some teething problems. I wouldn't say it's working fully, and if certainly in one of our clusters, we think there's an over-provision of inspectors and under-provision in another. So we're going to look how we can negotiate to move some of that to balance it out, so that the workloads are more managed.
So at the moment, you're not falling back on phone conferencing or video conferencing to do these interviews with detainees. Well, I can see your superintendent's looking at you.
Indeed.
Obviously, within Police and Criminal Evidence Act, the Code C, reviews, which the first inspector review is 6 hours and then subsequent ones are 9 hours, should be done face-to-face. That's the most favoured position. There are opportunities, if there are extenuating circumstances where an inspector can't get to the suite in time, that they can do that review by telephone. What we do ask is that if they do that, they still, at some point after that, go into the suite to check on the care provision for that individual. Video conferencing for reviews isn't actually enacted yet. Whilst it's in the Codes of Practice, the Secretary of State hasn't actually agreed that would be a method that we could use, but it would only ever replace telephone reviews rather than the face-to-face, but that's always the one we want to do.
At the moment, are you asking the custody managers to do face-to-face interviews instead of the inspectors?
Well, it really depends. That's about the custody support inspectors and the custody managers working together as a team to see who's available. If the custody support inspector is at the other suite that they have responsibility for and they can't get back, there has to be some negotiation and planning of the day of that inspector to actually make sure that they can programme in the reviews that they're required to do. If they can't get there, then obviously there's some liaison to be had with the custody manager if they're there, or if it comes to it, other inspectors who are available on that borough, and if they still have some difficulty, then they are advised to go to the grip and pace centre of that borough to seek some additional support.
Well, it does definitely sound as if you don't have enough inspectors at the moment. And all of so the custody managers and the inspectors, they're all trained to the same standard for the face-to-face interviews?
Yes, we've provided training and briefings for all inspectors who are new to the role. But all inspectors, when they're promoted, there's a promotion course. There is a custody input into that course at the very beginning of their careers as inspectors. And we've provided refresher training and refresher briefing for all of those.
It does sound as if there's not enough of a dividing line between the custody managers and the custody support inspectors if they're having to do each other's jobs.
I think it's perhaps relevant to maybe just explore what this responsibility is, because the expectation is that when somebody's been in custody for that length of time, 6 hours, there is, at a senior level, an independent review of why they're still there. Is the investigation progressing effectively, and does this person still legitimately need to stay with us? Now, anybody above the rank of inspector can perform that independent review responsibility. It's in PACE, it doesn't have to be a dedicated role, and as Annette has described, we train all our inspectors to do this as part of their custody input on their promotion. What we've done, though, is because we've recognised, and that's how we've been doing it, so any duty officer would come and do those reviews now, so that's any of the inspectors in territorial policing. The 88 that we've now dedicated to this, that's all they do, and we try and work with them to understand what the demand management is so that they can do that in the majority of times.
So it's still early days in a sense.
It is. And, you know, I think broadly, when I spoke to borough commanders on Monday and some of the custody sergeants, in many of the areas, this is working absolutely fine. But there are still some boroughs that have got geographical issues volume issues that it's still not quite as we would like.
So the clustering perhaps isn't right yet. You haven't got that right.
Absolutely, and I mentioned we're looking to move some inspectors from one into another to boost the demand that they're experiencing, so they have got enough capability to manage it in-house, and from April we're actually adding another 14 inspectors to this model to recognise that we need to increase the number to manage the workload.
And the clustering will be sorted by April as well, will it?
Well, that's
ongoing.
That's still as is. The clusters work pretty much based on the existing workloads, the number of custody throughputs, and they're fairly equal. We can provide a table or a chart of London that
would
shows
be really
that.
helpful, actually, so that we can get a...
But if there's a particular borough you're interested in, for example, we cluster Hillingdon, Harrow, Barnet and Brent, and between those 4 boroughs they have about 30,000 detainees per year, and the other 6 clusters are at a similar number. So there was a reason why the modelling looked at that. But, as with anything, I think as something new comes in, of course we revisit it, and that's what the inspection teams are doing to see what this is. And
It's really if you spot the mistakes and can fix them fast enough, isn't it? Because that's if you bed in and think we'll manage it, then that causes more problems. Can I ask you about the Police Federation has talked about the issue of 11-hour shifts, which, I mean, to me, reading about it, looked totally illogical. Can't understand it at all. I mean, it's way too long for most people to work and be effective at that length of time, but it's also too short to give you 24-hour cover. So, can you explain that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, shift pattern is an art and a science in itself, and there is, of course, overlay, so that there will be... Shifts don't just go 12 hours, and then there's nothing in between. There is an overlay across that provides, resilience at different change times. Part of the reason for the 11 hours is because we don't want, because of the handover responsibilities, to ensure that there is a careful and considered passing over of all of the issues.
So are there 3 11-hour shifts? No, there's only 2.
And Annette will be able to give, again, more detail of this because she's behind the design.
The shifts that we're developing for the inspectors and for the permanent custody teams, which are made up of the sergeants and the DDOs, are demand-led. And in terms of having to deal with the number of staff we've got, particularly around the inspectors, some areas and clusters will have 22-hour cover of that dedicated resource. So there will be 2 hours. I think it's around 5 a.m. to 7 where there isn't that cover. However, you have to remember that there are duty officers on duty during that time, and as Mr. Handstop has already said, any inspector can do these reviews. So it's about how we model the resources that we've got under the local policing model.
So you're saying that no detainee will have to wait 8 hours instead of 6 hours?
No, the plan is always to try and achieve the first review in 6 hours, and then subsequent reviews are 9 hours. And that's what we've modelled for. Obviously, there are some circumstances with, perhaps there's a large number of detainees that need a review at one station in that cluster, and the custody support inspector can't get back to the other borough for a review. Then that's a case of negotiating with colleagues who are in that other borough to carry out those reviews. And if there isn't anyone, we've trawled through and there isn't any other person that can go and do the face-to-face, then we fall back on a telephone review with the subsequent follow-up.
Training's a big issue, isn't it? And actually keeping people's training up to a good standard is...
I think it's more about understanding the responsibility. And maybe a practical example. So if you imagine somebody arrested at 10 o'clock at night or authorised detention 10 o'clock at night, their review is due at 4 in the morning. In PACE it says you shouldn't disturb people in their sleep time, because if they are asleep in custody, then for us to wake them up at 4 a.m. and say, I'm just telling you we're keeping you in custody while we investigate this, doesn't seem sensible or right. And so, of course, when they are they might still be reviewed at that time, and the inspector would say, look, we've not investigated this fully, they were arrested at night time, they've had some sleep, and so we will legitimately wait until normal hours of business, when we can get their legal team here, we can interview them and speak with witnesses, I think that would be a legitimate review process. But the detainee might not be told until they're woken at 6 a.m, so that there is, at the first realistic and reasonable opportunity to inform them that their detention has been authorised, that would take place at that time. And that's exactly as it's written in PACE, and part of the training would say we need to take a practical and reasonable approach to how we deal with detained persons. Now, of course, when we move on to the healthcare, there may be other issues around why we would wake people up throughout the night to check that they are still healthy, fit, and it's quite right that they are detained. But in the broadest sense, that might be the approach that we would take.
I'd like to go into this a bit more, but we haven't got the time, I don't think. Can I just ask you finally, these 11-hour shifts actually are not very good for a lot of women who are quite often primary carers for children and so on. That means you're going to have fewer... You are actually making life harder for women, aren't you?
Well, it's certainly not an intention to make it harder.
No, of course it's not, but it's a by-blow, isn't it?
Well, I'll come back to Annette, but the point I would make here is that shift pattern development is always in conjunction with the Federation. It's not simply an imposed, and when I've spoken with custody officers, there is a... actually, I'll probably withdraw this bit because what I speak with one custody officer might not be relevant for all, but there is an element about how and why we develop those shift patterns, and Annette can go into some of the detail of how the 11 and 12-hour plan has come around. I
don't think we need that. My point is more that you are already showing a severe lack of women working. In August this year, a joint inspection by HMIC and HMIP of Westminster custody suites highlighted a lack of female staff. You're actually making it harder for women in setting these. And I take your point that it's a police federation issue and they will be arguing with you, but I know that in other places the Met has been extremely tough on women workers and have actually made it very hard for them to do their jobs and keep their jobs, in fact. And this looks like another example of the Met not actually seeing further from its nose. It's thinking about, what suits it, but actually there's no care for the people who've got to implement it.
Can I just mention that there are opportunities within the shifts to have people working flexibly. So if someone wants to work a certain shift that is operationally acceptable and it suits the individual, we do have the flexibility to be able to incorporate that within the general...
every day, so day in, day out, that person could work that shift if it fits with childcare issues or dependence.
They would have to... The way it works is that they would provide us with a year's worth of rota that they would like to work. The manager would then look at that to see if operationally we can accommodate it. If we can't, we'd go back to them and try and negotiate and try and tweak that. But we always try to accommodate people who want to work flexibly. So there is scope within the 11 and 12-hour shifts, which a majority of people do like to do. We do appreciate that it doesn't suit everybody, and we will do our absolute level best to try and accommodate people's work-life balance commitments.
I just don't trust the Met on this, quite honestly, and I would like to know more about it. You might not have this information at the moment. How many women officers do you have currently working in custody suites? Could you let us have that information if you don't have it?
We'll see if we can find out today. I mean, it's a good point that you raise, actually, about is custody an attractive environment for female DDOs and sergeants to work in. I think it's something we do need to have another look at and work with the Federation to see their views on this.
But the 11-hour shifts are in operation now.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, presumably the Fed complained about it.
Well, I mean, I haven't personally had any complaints yet.
I'm still... you will now.
Maybe so. But, the only thing I can impress upon you is it's certainly my ambition to work closely with the Federation to understand this. I haven't seen, and I'm not certainly getting, as I've taken up post, a flood of complaints that 11-hour shifts are causing a problem. Other issues have risen.
But you have only been in post for 7 weeks. You might have missed the stream of complaints.
But I have met with the Federation during that time, though. This hasn't been a key concern.
Okay.
But I think you're right. It's something to look at about.
It's something that the Met has form on. Very bad form, I'm afraid. Actually, making life harder for women, officers and staff.
I think just the final point on that I would make is, there's not there's not an intention to make custody an environment that women wouldn't want to work in. It's certainly not a plan to do that. If it's a byproduct, I agree, it's something we may need to look at a little more carefully.
I've got Jeanette, then Tony. Jeanette.
Yes, it's just to carry on and just ask one quick question about this 11-hour shift. When was it introduced again?
Is it May?
It was this year, wasn't it? Yeah.
July this year.
July this year. And are you going to be monitoring it? I ask this because there's, I don't know how current it is, but I certainly recall challenges against 11 and 12-hour shifts that used to be worked in mental health establishments, because it just wasn't good for the staff, and when you looked at their performance and abilities over that period of time, it wasn't as good as somebody coming in and doing a 6 or a 4-hour shift. So work must have been done prior to its introduction. So will you be evaluating it at 6 months or a year?
Well, I mean, continually evaluating. It's only been in place for 8 weeks, so for any real
Look,
problems...
I just want to know when, and will it be formally done, and will we be able to see the formal evaluation? And if you haven't factored that in, then I think it would be a reasonable request from us through MOPSI to actually see that at 9 months or 18 months.
You know, there is a continual review of custody, but if you would like a formal update in 6 months' time as to how that's, on this particular issue, how that's
I think so.
out.
And then at that time we can actually look at the gender and ethnicity breakdown and age.
Yeah, no,
because this is a way of working that many trade unionists, including myself, fought against in public service, and I just find it shocking that we're now at a stage and it's being used for convenience of people. But that is if there's only 11 to 12-hour shifts on offer, that's not because it's convenient, it's because that's all that is on offer. And then you have to go and negotiate or tweak or fit yourself into it, and it just sounds to me as if you could actually be a little bit more progressive.
Thank you.
Going backwards, actually, that's the problem.
I mean, as Annette described, there are flexible opportunities, but that won't suit everybody. There is a reality, of course, in, you know, we are looking at custody as just one entity. You will know, I'm sure, from time in the MPA, it's a complex business policing, and with the shape of the organisation as it is now, to take 20% out of it means we have to do our business in a very different way. Absolutely, if we could put more people in custody, we could create more intricate shift patterns that could introduce, you know, 4-hour days, 5 hours, 6 hours, absolutely. But there's a degree of we can only provide a certain number of staff for certain roles. And this isn't understaffing it, I don't think, but we have to be very creative.
Absolutely, I understand what you're saying. I just think it would be good for us to see that evaluation of formal, and hopefully from someone outside of the MPS that could be contracted out through MOPAC so that we can see that. I think that would be interesting.
We'd perhaps take some terms from you after the meeting then, but we're more than happy to work with that, particularly on this issue.
I've got Tony then. We're just going to pick up some of those issues about MOPAC. Tony.
Yes, I was interested in hearing you describe the staffing of custody centres when you referred to sergeants. I thought that there were very few warranted police officers involved in the custody system. Certainly when I visited my local one, the Kingston Joint Custody Centre, I may say a very impressive set of premises. I've been in hotels which are worse. Particularly party conferences. And I understood that there was actually only one warranted officer who was permanently attached to that, who was indeed the inspector. So what is the split between warranted officers and others?
I'll bring that in a moment, if I may. I mean, the first thing to say, though, is it's a legislative responsibility that detainees must be assessed by a sergeant. So there is a responsibility for us to provide custody sergeants to do that. The inspectors, again, it's a supervisory responsibility rather than a a legislative one, apart from the fact that it needs to be an inspector to conduct the reviews. So there are some expectations laid out in PACE. If you think back to how it used to be, we used to have the custody sergeant and then we'd fill the custody office with PCs who would do all of the detention work. And so that's been the switch to bring police staff into those roles. In terms of numbers, we've 428 custody sergeant posts, 425 of those are currently filled. So in terms of meeting our obligations to ensure that people who are brought into custody are properly assessed by the right authority, I think we're meeting that pretty well. And that was more you wanted to add?
No, not really, sir. Just that Police and Criminal Evidence Act stipulates that it has to be a sergeant as the custody officer. So we have to provide that. That could never be outsourced. That has to be a police officer who is the custody officer.
Quick mathematical things suggest there are about 10 sergeants attached to each custody centre. Is that right?
I don't have it broken down as that, but
you said there were
quick maths would work out like that.
You said there were 460 sergeants, and I think earlier you said there were 36 custody centres.
There are 30 custody suites currently, 425 sergeants, so it's about...
So it's more than 10?
Sorry, 36 suites. Yes, yeah. But that covers the 24-hour shifts.
Of course, I understand that.
And some need more than one on duty.
Made about the shifts.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Roger.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a few questions about MOPAC's role in the design of the new arrangements. Ms Snelling, can you tell me, for a start, how far were MOPAC consulted on these proposals?
To the best of my knowledge, obviously precedes my time here. We have a very good working relationship with the Custody Directorate, and there are regular meetings between MOPAC colleagues and with the MPS on these matters. Of course, in reality, this is part of, as Commander Hanstock speaks, a wider change programme, of which, of course, we have been in consultation on and indeed heavily involved in. So, from that perspective, we have been involved in understanding the changes to be made. Of course, a lot of the detail that has just been discussed is very much in the operational policing, in terms of the resourcing and shift patterns, etc., etc.
If I can add to that, and part of our ambition from next year is to have a single detention command. That has gone through the Met's governance processes through Change Board and Management Board, and MOPAC have been represented on all of those boards to understand, hear and comment on the proposals. And so there's been inclusion at the strategic design level before we even introduce this.
Okay, well that's reassuring. What comments did MOPAC have to make on the proposals?
There was nothing that was presented, certainly at Change Board only 2 weeks ago, that would suggest our direction of travel was against what MOPAC would expect to see. Of course, there needs to be a degree of the business. The Met has got to shape its own position based on its resources, and this was one of a number of change programmes presented. But certainly, from my recollection, there was no resistance to what we were proposing.
Are you saying there is no response, or that there is a positive response?
I guess if no response is positive, there was no objections to it, and the broad agreement of that meeting, at which MOPAC were an integral part, not just an observer, was yes, we agree with this direction of travel.
Yeah. So, Ms Snelling, what work did MOPAC do to satisfy yourselves that this was going to be a beneficial change?
So I can't comment on the details of that, but I'd happily go away and obviously find some of that detail out. But I think, as Commander Hanstock says, there has been ongoing conversations, and of course this goes back over a period of time as well in terms of the custody improvement programme and the next kind of phases of that. In terms of the change programme from a couple of weeks ago, to the best of my knowledge, there have been conversations all the way through, both at the operational level through members of the team, and obviously up through in terms of the Deputy Mayor and indeed the Chief Operating Officer's involvement in those. But in terms of the specifics on that, I'd have to check.
So did the Deputy Mayor sign this off, or was this a responsibility devolved to one of the members of the MOPAC board?
I would need to double check that in terms of that specific piece, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of our internal governance, this is signed off by the Commissioner, yes. And in conversations with the Deputy Mayor, I guess they will be briefed on the direction of travel. I mean, I don't know if it would provide any reassurance to the panel if I just outline very briefly what those changes will be from April and how we're bringing in even greater controls and capability for custody overall.
Please.
In essence, from April we'll be introducing 7 Chief Inspector roles to this model, who will also be responsible for governance of the clusters. That provides another tier of leadership to examine risk, to examine custody compliance with legislation and how we're performing in terms of all of the investigative processes that take place. They are then a link to the local senior leadership team in a more dedicated way than we currently have. So it creates a greater coverage of responsibility across the suites. The fact that they're then clustered into these areas means there's better opportunity to brief and guide the inspectors. Each chief inspector will be responsible for around 15 inspectors, 53 custody officers and 110 detention officers. But it creates an opportunity to be more consistent in the way that we deal with custody detention issues across London. At the moment, the 32 boroughs have their own responsibility for doing that, and we certainly, and the Change Board agreed that this more streamlined, dedicated approach would provide greater protections and consistency in what we do in that environment.
And greater standardisation of practices.
Absolutely so, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, how does that link to MOPAC? How do you make sure that MOPAC are informed of what you're doing, and particularly if if, God forbid, you have a death in custody or an incident, how does that get reported to MOPAC?
And, yeah, perhaps Annette can talk more.
To provide members with some reassurance around the operational communication, I meet regularly with the MOPAC officer responsible for the independent custody visitors. So we meet probably every 6 weeks in an informal setting, but we talk about the progress of the project, particular issues that may have been raised by independent ICV panel chairs. If there's something that can't be dealt with on a local level, which most issues are, then that's escalated up through James Tate to me. And if there's something that there's any learning or any issues we need to deal with centrally, then that's where I and my team step in. But certainly in terms of updating around the developments of Met detention, that's where, in that informal setting, at the operational level, is where I engage with MOPAC.
Okay. Ms Snelling, have you given thought to how this is going to work in future? How hands-on do you want to be?
Yes, indeed, and I think one of the conversations that Commander Hancock and I will need to be having is actually how that will work in future. I think it's worth saying, I think to reiterate Annette's point, in terms of the MOPAC oversight, the ICV scheme, as you know, is the biggest scheme in the UK and actually gives us a whole suite of intelligence, and as Annette says, that is rigorously looked at, collated and indeed fed back through the panel chairs and also through conversations. And also, as Annette says, I guess the most of those issues, those localised issues, are then dealt with locally. And I think the conversation that I need to take on in terms of my brief now, having started with MOPAC, is just to make sure that with forthcoming activity that Commander Hasdock and I are clear on those relationships, and indeed making sure that we have all of the ICV scheme linked into our broader kind of oversight and governance.
And I think, interestingly, it's about how do these themes link across policing. So, for example, last night I was here with the stop and search leads for the boroughs. There's a confidence issue in communities around stop and search. Similarly, custody creates an equal level of concern and interest. We were discussing just very briefly this morning around the future of neighbourhood boards and how these kind of issues might generate into conversations with local communities and how we then have a process for feeding these points in and creating a discussion arena that the public feel that they've got a locus of involvement in. Certainly my position on this is we should be as open and transparent as we possibly can around something that is of key concern to to any society. This is about detention and restriction of liberties. We need to be open and available for inspection on that.
And I think just to add to that, if I may, I think you touch on a good point in terms of the creation of Safer Neighbourhoods boards and the role that they may play in terms of assuring that a system of independent custody is delivered in a local area. Of course, we would anticipate that those boards would receive regular reports and actually take an active interest that a scheme is being delivered. Of course, that statutory duty still sits through MOPAC, but actually the delivery of that, we believe, will bring greater transparency. And of course, as well, may well be that a representative from the ICV panel would be part of that board and would be able to escalate any issues. So I think that brings that down to very much then that neighbourhood level, building on what we already have in place in terms of ICV attendees, bringing that intelligence back together, and also builds on the good relationships between officers at MOPAC and with Annette's team. So that feels like the sort of the direction of travel, and Commander Hanstock and I will also talk about in terms of our respective roles, whether there's anything else that we will want to do in that governance space.
I'm sure the committee will maintain an interest in this, and this is maybe it's a little too early to answer this question, but what role do you see the Met's new ethics overseer playing in this?
I don't. If I'm honest with you, I don't know at this point in time.
I don't think anybody does. I think that's the point. No.
Not alone.
I think it's a useful question, and I don't have a comment on that at this point in time in terms of the development, but certainly happy to obviously take that away and feed that in.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Tony, if you wanted to follow up on the ICV point.
Yes.
Yeah.
You told us a fair amount about your relationship with ICVs already, about the informal meeting and so on. Truth of the matter is we hear very little from MOPAC about what ICV does. I think that there are no reports in the MOPAC annual report. It says nothing about ICV reporting. Is it because you've got nothing to publish?
No, absolutely not. I think, just to sort of go back to sort of the basics in terms of what happens in that kind of that process point. So a visit will take place and a written report will be made. MOPAC will receive and log those reports centrally. We would then look at those and identify any issues that require follow-up and a response from the MPS, and that would go through to the borough custody lead or indeed the borough commander as appropriate. And then should there be any significant issues identified, a conversation through with the Central Custody Directorate would happen. We also collate report data into the information that then goes to the ICV panels as well, and then that's discussed obviously in terms of preparation for those and then at those panel meetings. So I hear your point being made about where is that then data then going, and I understand the point previously that through the MPA committee system you would receive those on a regular basis. I'd like to take that away in my new brief to just give some thought to that information is there and available, but actually how we manage that. I think the key thing to say is that the data and intelligence is there, it is being collected, and most importantly it's being acted on in terms of intelligence that is then being used to either resolve or highlight local issues.
This is where I think there's some strength in the new model from next year. So with only having, if you like, 7 clustered areas, I think there's a responsibility on those chief inspectors to have regular conversations with ICVs, MOPAC, and review other issues that are coming out of the central team's inspections to say, what is the picture of activity in this cluster of custody officers, and do I need to do anything about it? I can't impress enough. We take the responsibility that we have around custody incredibly seriously. We're looking to how we invest in the estate, We've got plans to, over the next 2 years, to replace all of the recording facilities in custody with digital capabilities, so that we've got a much sharper capture of activity that occurs in custody. And all of this leads to a sense of understanding that the public clearly want to know what happens in these environments.
Well, indeed we do, and I take on what Marie has said in relation to that. Also very concerned about the link with the new Safer Neighbourhood Board. We're quite woolly on this. You will know that we as a committee, have done a report on the responsibilities of Safer Neighbourhood Boards, and this is one of the more important ones. But there is no positive, if you like, chain of information provision from the visitors to their Safer Neighbourhood Board. I think it says that they may be members of the board. A representative of the local ICV scheme may be expected to sit on the Safer Neighbourhood Board. Now, that's not a terribly good way of reporting back, because they may not come. One of the other difficulties, and I say this as a member of 3 different borough previous incarnations of these boards, the custody visitors, somebody from the custody visitors would turn up, but often we were told that there was an incredible shortage of these. How are you going to ensure, if indeed it is you, because it will be poacher and gamekeeper, that you're able to recruit these? This must be a MOPAC matter.
Can I just go back to the point with the link on the Safer Neighbourhood Board, and just to answer your point on that, if I may. I think you're right around the wording in terms of may be required. I think the reason for that is that it is for local areas to determine the constitution around how exactly a Safer Neighbourhood Board operates in a local area, and the suggestion of having an ICV panel member as a member of the board is absolutely a commitment. If that is something that the board is looking to have, then absolutely we would need to work to ensure that that happens, and indeed that the regular reporting is being provided through. So I just want to sort of give an assurance around that. On the recruitment side, it's not at this point an area that I have delved into with the team in my 3rd week, but I will certainly take that through. As you know, we have the biggest scheme here, and I can understand the assurances needing to be made in terms of ensuring that we've got enough ICVs to cover all of the areas. As I understand it at the moment, that is an issue that you're raising, but I need to look into detail around what those plans are.
Yes.
Thank you.
Again, if I can add to that, because in fairness, Maria and I haven't had a chance to have a long conversation yet, but I think there's more fundamental issues around how, and it's not for me to suggest how MOPAC do business, but if you think about how do we ensure that there is robust independent scrutiny of a number of areas, and I was making the connection with the stop and search panels last night. We have independent advisory groups, there's the issue of disproportionality, complaints, all interest areas to both the committee and the public. You know, in my experience, there is a risk with all of these individual schemes that they get too cosy and that people don't see the issues quite so clearly. And certainly the challenge I used to give as a borough commander to my panels were, we need to be polite, but I need you to challenge me. It's no good coming and telling me everything's fine. I need you to find the things that are going wrong. And part of our development moving forward, and perhaps it might be an ambition of the boards, is to just think about how rigorous these scrutiny exercises are and what areas they really want to be the eyes and ears of you and the public on, because we shouldn't be fearful of challenge.
Well, I would hope that you wouldn't be.
Well, sometimes we are here, but...
It manifests there's going to be a very substantial change for ICV, in the sense that it used to be that there were tiny clusters of police cells scattered about, but now there is going to be a much greater concentration on larger custody centres, and it may be, although we call them volunteers, it may be that, again, this must be a MOPAC matter, perhaps there should be a looking into far greater training of ICVs, because of course they will be dealing with far larger numbers with the unannounced visit. I mean, I look at your occupancy rates already, and they're quite high, so instead of going and visiting your local cells where there might be just one person there, could easily go, there'd be 12, 15 people in there. So it does need to be professionalised. Is that something you're going to give attention to, training of these characters?
I think
it's a MOPAC thing, really.
I think that's one that we need to discuss jointly, but actually sits with us in terms of the overall running of the ICV scheme. And I think what you're highlighting are a number of pieces of the jigsaw that, you know, in terms of my new role here, obviously need to look into in far greater detail in terms of how the scheme develops. Absolutely, I think it is worth recognising that we have been through a period of transition. And indeed, in terms of a scheme of this nature that is operating with volunteers, you know, I think actually it does remarkably well in that respect. And indeed, the operational side of that, and the collecting of data, and the ongoing use of it as an oversight mechanism is on the whole working. I take the points that are being made here today in terms of thinking about how that then links with the wider change programme. And certainly Commander Hasstock and I will be talking about that as we develop our relationship.
Thank you, Chairman.
Quickly.
No, it's just to Marie, recognising that you've just taken over.
Of course.
And this is a period where you're now getting in the proposals from the Safer Neighbourhood Boards in terms of their structures. Will you agree to ensuring that as soon as you've been able to make that analysis in terms of the makeup of the board, that you can let us have that? Because you said that, following on from Tony's point, that there may be a representative on the SNB, and then you said, well, it's up to them to determine that. Then, of course, they may well determine that they don't want a representative. So the analysis of the models that you're getting, when that is completed, can we be assured that you'll release that information as soon as possible?
Yes, what I would say is that in terms of the guidance around Safe Neighbourhood Boards in relation to ICV, which is what we're talking about here this morning, the suggested membership includes through someone from the ICV panel, as I've already stated, and that guidance will be coming out in the middle of October. Once we get those then proposals back, we will be able to see those.
That we can have access to that
I understand
material.
your point. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Can I just make one quick point to Marie? You started off answering earlier and saying that you have to be very careful not to get involved in operational issues. We were talking about the staffing and the supervision at the custody suites. And can I just say that I think members have felt too often that's been said by MOPAC as a reason why you shouldn't look at something. But of course, MOPAC does have oversight in general, so I just bear that warning in mind that to say something's operational doesn't necessarily mean that MOPAC doesn't have a role in challenging and ensuring.
Point heard.
But can I just ask a question to Adrian, and that's just, when you were developing the proposals for the new custody arrangements, who did you consult? Because we've heard rumours that MPS, Internal Health and Safety, weren't consulted about the changes, and there were some concerns about that internally.
I don't want to just hand this back to Annette, because obviously a lot of work has gone on since we, since this issue has been raised more recently, and obviously Annette was involved a lot longer than I was. I think it's fair to say that probably some of the internal communication and engagement is not as sharp as it should have been, and that's an early reflection and recognition through our assessment of where we are with it. That's not saying no consultation took place, probably didn't happen with the right people and include as many as it should have done, particularly with the Federation in that respect. That's something I'm hoping we're unpicking now, but that's something that will now take place. In terms of the health and safety branch, Nat, are you able to sort of comment as to who was involved in that, whether they were formally, and if, I guess if not, they weren't, and that we can't unpick that? But.
The changes that have been made up until this point were the governance around that was a custody improvement project board chaired by Mr Henstock's predecessor, Nick Fgrave, and as far as I recall, HSE, our health and safety colleagues, were members of that board, so they obviously were updated along with everyone else. Some of the other engagement around, and I know some members will remember the original Operation Herald as MBA members, which was the change in the forensic healthcare services and the introduction of designated detention officers. There was a separate board for that as well, and there were particular members around the governance of that, including Federation and the other staff associations and trade unions. One of the things we did, particularly in terms of engagement locally, was the custody improvement team went out and carried out borough change impact assessments along with each of the borough commanders, because obviously how we deliver custody has an impact on partner agencies and colleagues. So there was some work done locally so that borough commanders had an opportunity to engage and to consult, and also to provide feedback to the team in terms of how we were building up these permanent custody teams and what that would look like going forward in the future, and obviously into Met Detention as a dedicated command. So there was some quite significant work done at the local level, as well as the central contacts with relevant colleagues.
And can I ask, did you have any independent challenge as that process? And in future, would it be sensible to look at some of the independent challenge that might be available, both with MOPAC and the NPS?
Absolutely, and obviously we have a really positive relationship with HMICP, and they are aware of the plans that we were having, and we had discussions with them about what our future model would look like. So there was some independent of scrutiny of us moving forward, and of course they've inspected since we've had the permanent custody teams in place.
And certainly an example of that internally is recognising that we didn't have enough inspectors in the model based on very early findings. We were able then to present a convincing case to Management Board for an increase of the 14 to provide that greater resilience that we wished for. I suppose what I would be trying to impress on the panel is, we're trying to develop the best operational model that manages the risks in custody, but, ensures that we get full operational delivery and maximise what custody opportunities give us. That's to investigate an offence and determine whether or not somebody should be accountable for that, but also fits the financial envelope that the Met finds itself in. So there's a number of challenges around designing the perfect model. Yeah. I think what it's clear to say, though, Management Board did recognise this presents significant risk in a number of areas and have then invested heavily in it. The fact that we've been able to provide additional chief inspectors, the fact that we now have or will have nearly 100 dedicated inspectors to this role where we hadn't previously, I think demonstrates to quite some degree our commitment to this particular area of business.
We're going to come on shortly to the health care that's provided, but Jenny, you had a final question.
Yes, this is more for a subsequent inquiry we're doing, but I just would like to know, does the Met use emergency response belts in custody suites?
No, we don't.
You don't possess them at all?
I couldn't answer. It's not something I've come across. I'll have to come back to you. Certainly, Dave Martin, who's the commander who managed that issue, put a letter out nationally yesterday around this, but I'd have to revisit exactly what it is. But certainly, as
it would be good
we don't use.
We made an assessment of them some time ago, and we decided that we didn't want to use them.
So you don't even own any? Lovely.
Not within custody, no. Not as far as I know. No.
Thank you.
Presumably you did your assessment and it came to the conclusion that what, they weren't effective or they weren't safe?
You'll have to forgive me, that was before my time, but we can certainly find out for you.
If you could update that, that'd be useful. Thank you very much. I'm now just going to adjourn for 2 to 3 minutes while we rearrange the seating arrangements for our next session.
GLA, Chamber, Sound. 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 GLA, Chamber.
We're reconvening this meeting now that our guests have been seated, and we have rather a lot of guests in this session, rather probably double the amount that we're used to having. So perhaps I can ask our guests to perhaps try and keep your answers as concise as possible and not necessarily repeat answers that have been given. That would be very helpful. And perhaps for those members of the audience and those viewing, can we just go from Karen? Perhaps you just say your name and your title again for us.
Yes, certainly. I'm Karen Swinson. I'm the Director of Nursing for the Met Police.
Thank you.
Good morning, Annette Whiteman. I'm the head of the Custody Directorate for the MPS.
Commander Adrian Hanstock, and I hold the portfolio at ACPO for crime, criminal justice and detention.
I'm Alison Gill. I was a nurse in the Metropolitan Police 2009 to 2010.
I'm Peter Green. I'm a forensic medical examiner for the Met.
I'm Jason Payne-James. I'm a forensic medical examiner for the Met and senior lecturer at Barts and the London School of Medicine and Dentistry.
Can I thank you all for coming this morning? And this session is particularly looking at the healthcare of detainees in MPS custody. And perhaps I can start with our two doctors, who are also FMEs, forensic medical examiners, with the police service. I understand that you've done research in the past with regards to average times it takes for detainees to be seen by healthcare professionals. Can you just give me your overall top-line views as to the changes that the service detainees have received since the custody arrangements were changed in around 2009, where nurses were meant to be put into every custody suite?
Yes, in fact, we haven't done research into response times. The Met itself, when establishing the new changes, did in fact publish response times for, at that time, doctors or forensic medical examiners to attend custody detainees. And the figures that were produced at that time with regard to developing the project showed that about 78% of detainees were seen within a 1.5 hour period, and then I think about 98% within 3 hours. I think the problem that we have, in fact, is that since the changes have moved on, it appears, and I don't believe there are any data that can formally support that, but that there are now increased times and delays despite the introduction of the new system of forensic medical examiners and custody nurse practitioners. At the moment, the way in which the data would be able to be collated would be via the NSPIS computer system, which identifies when a doctor or nurse practitioner is asked to see a detainee in custody. And that system, as I understand it, and I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, cannot currently be interrogated to determine that. So the concern is that there is increased times for detainees being seen as opposed to the original timings prior to the changes in 2009.
Okay, and we'll come on to some of, we'll ask them better about that in a moment. But are there any other headline issues that you feel are of concern?
I think probably the biggest concern is the lack of both doctors and nurses, so that there are times when some custody suites may go for 6-hour or 12-hour periods without any true cover. There may be cross-cover from other areas that are already being covered by other doctors. There may be custody nurse practitioners in part available in some 24-hour supposed covers, but there are a number of times when there isn't immediate availability of healthcare professionals, which include both doctors and nurses, to detainees in custody.
Okay. Dr. Green, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I would. I think one of my other roles is association with the Council of Europe, where I'm the chair of an informal group of medical advisors, and there are some international aspects to custodial care which I think could reasonably be highlighted in this analysis. One of the problems, I think, which, having employed nursing staff helping in custody, is that there's a sense, maybe more a perception than a reality, but there's certainly a sense of a loss of independence. And this is a very important theme in the Council of Europe Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. I won't say that again, I'll say CPT. And that committee, which does inspections, and as you probably are aware, is the result of an international European convention which we have signed and ratified in this country, and therefore it's binding upon us all to comply with that. And one of the key points in the standards which have been developed by the CPT is about independence of those medical practitioners who work and assist in custodial environments and in other places of detention too. So that, I think, is a headline point. And formerly, before we had custody nurses working, all healthcare provision was provided, as you know, by doctors, by FMEs, who were fiercely independent and whose contractual arrangements, and they still are designed to maintain that independence. So I think that's an issue which is certainly a perception which should be, some regard should be paid to as we look forward to what can be done about the problems that we have at the moment. Secondly, one of the other standards which I think is significant in this is that the element of consent and confidentiality, which is part of healthcare provision outside places of detention, we all know that because it's everyday practice for us when we go and see our own doctors, is considerably challenged with the new arrangements. And I think an example of that is that, broadly speaking, there's an unwillingness for custody nurse practitioners to be left, and I can understand why, in situations where they may be at risk. So that conversations will be had with a custody nurse practitioner which should, according to the international standards, be confidential and in private, and indeed the standard that is set is out of earshot and preferably out of eyeshot, or out of the eye line of the jailers or the detention officers. And that's quite difficult for custody nurse practitioners to apply. So I think that's something else which needs to be focused on. The other issue, which I think is another standards issue, is about the integration of medical information into the police information setup, for want of a better expression. And the international standard is that there should be very clear separation between the two. And indeed, the CPT standard said it's the doctor's responsibility to look after those notes. And indeed, FMEs do have that. But with the nurses taking over more and more of that work, that's less obviously the case.
Is that by dint of them being employed directly by the nurse
yes,
and
it
their
is.
contracts?
I'm not an expert on this,
Right.
but looking at the way I practice and looking at the way the nurses are asked to practice, I see a difference, and that I think is something which has relevance in the way future healthcare should be provided. So, I mean, those are just a few issues around standards which I think are worth reflecting on.
Thank you for that. We'll now move to some detailed questioning, and no doubt those will be picked up a little later. But Victoria, you've introduced some other headline.
Thank you very much indeed. Many of us were on the Civil Liberties panel a year or so back now, but one of the concerns there was about consistency, transparency, some of which you've just touched on, and also inevitably that you attract, whether you wish to or not, a lot of people with mental health issues, because regrettably you're often seen as the first point of or place of safety. And so I just wanted to preface my other questions with that point, and we may be something we would follow up with you all later, but if you could just think about those points as well. I think some of our concerns are that people should be very aware exactly what is going to happen to them at any time, that it should be clearly stated, it should be visible. In other words, there should be some, for example, list that's clearly, the same list should be at every police station, the same information of the procedures about their health care, about where they can turn for support, what other needs that they have, and how they're going to be treated, how samples are going to be taken, how long those samples are going to be kept for, and the general overall, how their DNA is going to be taken, as you say, obviously their fingerprints and any other samples that are needed as part of the work that you're doing. So we have had previously concerns about the consistency and then also how the samples were kept. Again, and you've talked about, again, medical confidentiality. So we have various members of this committee have expressed those concerns before, so any of that, if you wish to answer any of those when replying to my other questions, I will be grateful. So what we really need to know around this horseshoe is, are you satisfied, and we'll start first I think with the MPS, that the current system for healthcare provision in custody suites is operating better than the previous system, and how do you quantify that, and what's good and what do you think still possibly needs to be improved?
Thank you. I'll just say a few general things, and if I may, I'll hand over to Karen, who has been leading on this for longer.
But you do, Adrian. Could I just say that our next month's meeting is around mental health and policing, so we will be exploring a lot of those.
That was just one of the categories I mentioned.
Thank you. I'll try and avoid then talking about our sort of liaison diversion schemes that we will be coming on to. But I think it's important to remember here we've really got the clashing of two professions in the lowest sense of that term, because we've got a clinical need to understand the issues affecting the individual, but we've also got an investigative need to explore the suggestion they're involved in an offence. And clearly there's some information that's going to be needed by both parties to that position. If there are issues from their clinical background or condition that will influence our decision to keep them in custody or how we then deal with them whilst they're in custody, there is an expectation that we need to share some of that data. And I know that this is part of the difficulty we experience and how we separate and keep the independence that Dr. Green describes there, to make sure that we're not party to things that legitimately we shouldn't be, but at the same time aware of risk. But the question you asked was, are we convinced that we've got a better position than we previously had? And if I can just invite Karen to sort of talk through what some of those changes are, why they were brought in, and whether that's giving the improvements that we would like to have seen.
Thank you. I think the general principles behind the introduction of a nursing service that take us back some 10, 12 years ago now were really to improve the quality of care that was delivered. And that was through having nurses present 24/7 in a custody suite to support the custody sergeant's role, because up until that point, he or she was ultimately responsible for the health and welfare of that individual. I think the other two were to reduce deaths in custody, because nationally we had seen an increase of deaths in custody, and that was something that we really all needed to reduce. And thirdly, we wanted to achieve best value in this service. There have been some previous white papers written which suggested that previous services weren't necessarily as efficient or effective as they could have been. As a result of those, the Home Office created some pilots to see if there were any other individuals who could conduct this work. And paramedics and nurses were identified, and they've now gone on to be introduced into the legislation that supports that work. I think the service overall now has run for many years. We in the Met have introduced it in the last 5, coming up 6 years. I think nationally, if I can speak nationally, overall services have definitely improved. And we've certainly seen that in the Met with our external inspector reports, where we can see definitely an improvement in the care and quality delivery, and the outcomes of those recommendations by HMIC, HMIP in those areas where we have nurses.
You have access to those reports? We haven't seen those reports. Are they?
Beg your pardon?
Are they internal reports, or are they publicly
No,
available?
those are HMIC about, again, probably 5 or 6 years ago, joined up with HMIP so that they could collectively conduct healthcare inspections within police custodies. So they drew upon the knowledge of their colleagues who previously inspected prisons to specifically look at healthcare and police custody.
Sorry, how often are you inspected and how do we see the reports?
Those reports are publicly available documents. The lead for those inspections is a lady called Elizabeth Tyso. And they do unannounced and announced inspections, and that's across not just the Met but nationally.
Yes, obviously our concern, our responsibility is the Met, but that's fine. So
yes,
continue. That's helpful. Thank you.
Sometimes they will give us prior knowledge that they're coming. Other times they'll just contact the custody suite and say we're outside.
Okay, so just to check, they check on the medical care of the detainees and also other consistencies, or what other would they?
Yes, they have quite a criteria to inspect against, and that can be about the facilities within the environment. They speak to the doctors, they'll speak to the nurses, they'll speak to detainees about their experiences, they'll do checks on the safety elements of the suite. One of the things that they're very, very keen to make sure everywhere gets correct is the management of medications in police custody.
And how often would they inspect, and what's something that they deemed, I don't know what the terms are, I know them for Ofsted, unsatisfactory? I mean, how would they return or ensure that an area that they thought was of concern was addressed?
Yes, well, they don't grade as such, like Ofsted would, but they do give us recommendations that we then, as an organisation, follow up. And
are you under any obligation to follow those up, or is it merely your desire to follow them up?
No, I think we would always go back to them. We meet with them quite regularly to measure and monitor our progress in where we're trying to get to. And we would have quite a close relationship with those that the recommendations that we can meet and those sometimes that we just can't. So, for example, some of our estate means that the rooms are quite small, so there are certain things that we can't fully meet within those rooms, and we work ways to make sure that those are still safe until such times as any refurbishment work can be undertaken.
Some of the concerns that were expressed earlier by Dr Green and Dr Payne-James were on slightly different issues. Would those be ones that will also be covered in this inspection or not?
Yes, the HMIC inspections very much look at the notes and our storage of those notes, and indeed the storage of the FME notes as well.
I think it wasn't just
Dr.
storage.
Payne-James wants to come in.
Yes, do you want to just... Can I just ask, have you ever been party to these? Because actually, it wasn't just storage of notes you talked about. You talked about how things were undertaken and whether they were supervised or not. So perhaps you just touch on that. Thank you.
If I can respond to Karen, and Karen's quite right, there is regular HMI-CP inspections. I think it is absolutely crucial to understand HMI-CP do not look at clinical outcome. They do not, to my knowledge, look at medical notes. The medical notes that, for example, I keep and all forensic medical examiners keep are private contemporaneous notes. Quite rightly, as has been said, what is relevant to the medical care and health care and welfare of detainees in custody, that information is given with consent of that detainee to the police, and on the police computer record on the detained person's medical form, those issues of healthcare that are relevant to the care and welfare and police process are put on those detained person's medical forms. It would not be appropriate for example, HMICP to see confidential medical records of detainees who have been seen in custody without the consent of that detainee. So I can't speak clearly for every case, and Karen may have got examples of doctors who have disclosed notes. That would not be necessarily appropriate, and I can't also comment on whether or not the pro forma completed by the custody nurse practitioners are also disclosed to HMICP. I am not aware of HMICP being able to comment on the nature of the assessment and the care of whether it's a patient with mental health problems, a patient with drug misuse problems, or all the other general vulnerabilities that many of the patients that we see have. I think it's also important to point out, and Karen quite rightly has raised the issue of the reduction in deaths in custody. That is in the whole context of awareness brought about in many respects by the Independent Police Complaints Commission. And in fact, ourselves, the Met Police Service and the Independent Police Complaints Commission have done research collaboratively to look at reducing not only deaths in custody but exploring near-miss incidents in custody. Overall, across the country, there has been a reduction in deaths in custody, partly brought in by better vigilance, better awareness, better training, and that will apply whether or not doctors, nurses, paramedics or mixed groups, whether they're employed directly by police forces, whether they are outsourced to commercial providers. There's been a general reduction. I think it is important to say that the delivery of healthcare, and to re-emphasise what I've said, is that there are times within the Met when there is non-availability in certain custody suites for either custody nurse practitioners because of sickness or lack of nurses, where forensic medical examiners may be called upon to cross-cover other areas, although the areas are planned so that they produce the appropriate amount of work for each group. So whether or not the overall numbers of death in custody have reduced as a result, I don't think it's as a result of the implementation of a new system. And just finally, to make the point, we are very, very keen, as we do in any other aspect of work, to work in a multi-professional setting. And I perhaps need to make that clear that for us, working with nurses is an important part of our professional.
Come to Peter Green. I think we need to hear from Adrian as to whether there was any medical inspection in the custody suites.
That was what I was going to address. I was party to bringing together HMIC and the Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine, which is the standard setter for custodial healthcare, as you probably know, about just over a year ago. And as a result of that coming together, there's now been a memorandum of understanding. The purpose behind this was to try and get FMEs with experience and expertise involved in the inspection so that they can make the qualitative healthcare assessments, which I think are so important in this area of work, as much across the country, as much in the Met as it is elsewhere, because there are hundreds of thousands of people who come in and out of custody, and we have done some research about the healthcare needs of those in detention, and it shocked us what we found. The mixture of vulnerabilities and the complexity of the case which are dealt with, and therefore the need for the standards of care to be upheld and to be checked to make sure they're being upheld. I don't think, and forgive me, I may be doing them an injustice, but I don't think at the moment that the HMIC/P would say that they've got the competences and capacity to do that at the moment, and I think that's a really important message too.
Memorandum of Understanding, is that one that's signed up by all police forces?
No, this is between the Inspectorate and my faculty, our faculty.
So that's about improving the inspections.
That's right.
And checking. Adrian, and then I'm going to come back to Victoria.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. You know, we wouldn't expect inspectors of constabulary prisons to look at individual personal clinical notes, and that doesn't happen. The Inspectorate focuses on policing processes. I mean, the one thing I really need to impress, though, is whilst it's absolutely vital that we have nurse and FME cover and that, if you like, that immediacy of the advice we can get, that's not the only medical provisions that we give to persons in care. We always have the fallback of calling in paramedics, ambulances, or indeed taking people to hospital or having them take the hospital by ambulance. You know, the care of the individual has got to be based on somebody's initial assessment, and this is where custody officers are in that invidious position that it is their responsibility to make an assessment of that person. The advice and the professional guidance that they're able to access through having nurses either available on site at the time 24 hours a day, with all of the challenges that presents to provide that level of cover, and also from FMEs that provide that on-demand service on call, just helps support those assessments they need to make. But there's always the usual emergency service situations that officers can rely on to provide that degree of care.
Victoria. Okay, so I mean, just back to our original question, I mean, because we're obviously conscious that what we're trying to analyse here is whether the healthcare provision in custody suites is operating better than before, and what fail-safes we should have. Inevitably, there are people who come under you who are going to be drunk, under the influence of drugs and other things. So what, they may have fallen into your hands for all sorts of reasons, and do we think that they're getting the right response times and the right care in order to sort them out? Okay. Who wants to start on that one?
I think we've all agreed that the multidisciplined provision of using nurses and doctors is the right way forward, and that's what we've always been trying to achieve. If I can be quite blunt, our difficulty is recruitment, not only of custody nurse practitioners but also of FMEs, and so therefore the fact that we don't have enough, we know how many we would like but we don't have enough, and I'm sure Karen can explain more about market forces that are currently against us, and also those issues that manifest themselves in the NHS as well around recruitment of nurses, so that then it can be exacerbated with sickness, long-term absence and that sort of thing. So we on a daily basis have to manage the provision that we supply. If we had enough FMEs, if we had enough nurses, the service would be better. It's not broken, but it's not as we would like it to be.
Is that a fair comment?
That's a very fair point, and it's absolutely right.
We've acknowledged that. Let's build on that.
We've acknowledged that. Our original desires from the Project Herald of having a certain number of nurses in every borough in the NPS, supported by the FME function, was perhaps overambitious.
You came up with a good system, but at the moment you haven't got the resources to resource it.
The system still stands.
Probably because it's more expensive?
Well, because we were perhaps overambitious in our assumption that we could recruit so many nurses. It's a very difficult market to actually bring the right level of nurses into our organisation, and that's really where we've stumbled, to be quite
blunt. But when you came up with this new idea, was the overall cost of the new system going to be more expensive?
It was going to reduce the resource requirement in terms of funding, but that wasn't the priority. It was around timeliness issues, as Dr. Payne-James has mentioned. We wanted to improve the timeliness of response. Now, clearly, having a nurse on scene at the time obviously is going to increase that significantly. But we needed to improve the timeliness. We wanted to improve and become within ACPO guidelines around timeliness of perhaps FME attendance. So,
but I think you've all just said that in order to provide the ideal, it would evidently be more it would be more costly, both in terms of personnel and.
Well, in terms of personnel, yes, because obviously we were introducing nurses that we didn't have before. But actually, in terms of financial cost, it is going to be less, because the system we had previously was an on-demand service from FMEs. So one of the changes that we made was that they would work shifts, so they would be paid per shift rather than per activity, which was costing quite a lot of money, and we weren't necessarily centrally able to manage that budget.
I notice both the doctors want to come in, then we'll move on.
But before you do, could we just go on? So what are the comparative costs from before and after? Have you saved money or not?
Yes, but minimal. So it's probably about £500,000 saving currently.
But you're not fully staffed up to where you would want to be anyway.
Because we haven't achieved what we wanted to in terms of the Project Herald.
I mean, perhaps I can say I know that originally the Project Herald in February 2008 was hoping for a saving of £1.5 million. This is from and that was based on a nurse deployment, this is by 2011, of 200. I think we've got 67 nurses currently. We did a freedom of information study of all police forces across the UK in 2007 about costs of provision of medical health, peer-reviewed published data, which showed, in fact, Met at that time was per contact with detainee the cheapest service around. We repeated that study last year, and unfortunately, and it's good to hear those numbers are there, that the Freedom of Information application from the Met was declined on grounds of commercial confidentiality under Section 43 of the FOI. So I can't, from my own FOI data from 2007, which was published, and the data was shortly to publish on 2012, I'm not able to give the relative costs of what the service costs now, but obviously the Met may be able to give you the actual costs for what it's costing to run now, because I don't know, and that data has not been available via FOI.
Sorry, so just so I've understood, and for the sake of the record, at the moment we've got 67 nurses, and we've got 30-something...
69.
69 nurses, thank you for the sake of the minutes, and 30 custody suites. 36 custody suites, good, so we've all got the right figures. Dr Green, I think you indicated, and I'll pass back to the Chairman to the next section.
Can I just come to Adrian then? The costings, can you provide the committee with a full breakdown of the costings?
I mean, yes, we can, but of course things have moved on since Herald, as you would expect. And again, it's important to say this isn't just about costs, this is about the level of clinical governance.
Well, can I ask about the response times as well? You still haven't said what the response times currently now are.
Okay, and I'll see if we have that broken down for you. In terms of costings, as I say, things have moved on, and as part of the commercial strategy that MOPAC have set, we are working to understand what services within the whole policing environment might lend themselves to that degree of external commissioning. And, of course, medical healthcare is in scope for that. At the moment, we haven't baselined exactly what we think the new model, based on our new detention model from April next year, would look like. So whilst we have the Herald ambition, we have our interim position as is now, we are also developing the optimum model under the new custody or new single detention command that may in fact change before we look to any external commissioning of that service. So the figures, the funding, the as-is spend might not in any way look like what our intended ambition is. I think what I can tell you in the broadest sense that our current cost for custody healthcare is round about £13 million.
Our budget is £13.4 million this year.
I'm really sorry, while I've got you all here, could I just go back to this consistency and transparency and point? Would be something that's picked up in those inspections or not?
Sorry, you're referring...
The consistency of how samples are taken, how detainees are handled, how procedures are gone through.
Yes.
So that would be picked up,
yes.
Fine. Okay, so that's a good start. And sorry, I think Dr Green, you indicated earlier.
Well,
to go back to the Chairman's questions.
Can I just come back to the response times? Yes. Do you have an answer on the response times?
I don't have it in hand. We'll see if you're happy to pause, we'll come back to that and I'll get one of those things.
I can give you some evidence. Obviously, if we have nurses in 15 stations, how many of those are 24? We have 7 stations that have 24/7 cover nurses, and the others are partially staffed. Obviously, there isn't an issue with arrival times because the nurse is there. In terms of FME arrival, we are struggling to meet the ACPO guidelines of around 2 hours. Sometimes we get there, sometimes we don't. In terms of actually number crunching, the performance on that is quite difficult for us at the moment because NSPIS, which is the electronic custody record, management information, getting that particular piece of management information is dependent on custody sergeants checking a box when they phone up and ask for an FME to attend. Unfortunately, our compliance with that isn't brilliant at the moment, so we can't give a complete picture of arrival times, but we do acknowledge that we're not always complying with the ACPO guidance. However, we have processes in place where FMEs and nurses can triage the cases they need to see and put them up in terms of urgency. And also we have an escalation process for custody officers and staff in terms of if there isn't an FME or a healthcare professional immediately available. And that goes into going to a different area or a different station or calling an ambulance.
Of course, the ability to performance manage your systems is going to be vital, and if it's failing on the fundamental thing as someone not ticking a box that would give you that performance data, that's obviously an area of concern. So obviously that leads me to say, well, what are you going to do about it?
Quite simply, we're replacing NSPIS. There's a programme by 2015 that will have looked at all of our core systems. If it's just about times of arrival, I imagine we'll be looking at systems where the FMEs themselves can indicate at what time they've arrived. It shouldn't rely on a custody officer having to do that. So there is a replacement programme in place to do that. In the meantime, the compliance issue that Annette has highlighted, it's one of the issues that is flagged with me when I've taken over, and work was underway as early as Monday of this week with borough commanders as to how we're going to improve that compliance.
So in 6 months' time, you should be able to tell us that you've got better performance data.
We certainly should.
Okay. Dr Green, you want to come in?
I want to come back to this issue of time it takes to get an FME to see somebody. It's a metric, and it's handy because it can be measured. But the new world in which we're living in at the moment means that FMEs like myself and Jason have to travel far further than we used to have to. At the weekend I was on call, and the stations that I had responsibility for stretched from Peckham in the north to Croydon in the south, which is a large area, and you can imagine of a weekend driving from one to the other, as I may have had to do from time to time, can be really very challenging. So, and this has been introduced because the size of the areas since the new arrangements came in January 2009 have, for good management reasons, been made larger. But there is a risk attached to that, and that is this. The FMEs are required to see the most complex and difficult cases, the ones which the nurses need support and help with, or which legislatively only the doctors can deal with. At the same time, we now have the prospect of a structure which I think, if I've gathered the intimation right, that we're going to be having even larger areas for FMEs to cover, having inbuilt into it an increase in the delay. And I think this is an important issue, because whilst delays are relatively straightforward to manage, to evaluate and get some figures for, what really matters is the quality of care, or no, what matters as well and just as importantly is the quality of care that the detainees are receiving and the expert advice that the police are being offered and the way in which that is being done. And when you have a reduction in the number of nurses that you have planned to have, and it's somewhere between 60 and 70 depending on how you count it, and the number of FMEs which is sliding as well, this is, as I think Annette's already admitted, is not the best circumstance, and I don't see there's an easy way or a clear plan out of this at the moment, certainly one that we have been consulted about at any rate.
Okay. I'm really sorry, just for the sake of us understanding here, what can a nurse do and what can a doctor do, just so that we've got a bit of an understanding, because you said there were certain things
I think
that only you can...
Jeanette's going to move on to that now, if that's okay. Jeanette?
Yeah. Chair, thank you. Can I just say there is... I've got so many questions that I know I won't be able to ask. So in our normal way, Chair, can you ask our visitors to take extra questions after we finish? Yes. And can I just start with Dr. Peter Green? And you gave us the information about where the context of where this work sits in terms of legislation with human rights, the Council of Europe and CPT.
Yes.
And I might have heard it wrong, because what I heard was you were saying that whereas doctors have been able to maintain confidentiality and are not in breach of any regulations or guidance. That I think I heard you say that nurses, because they are employed by the MPS and sometimes have custody officers with them, that they're in breach of their professional duty to give that same duty of care to the person in custody. Did I hear wrong? Or
it wasn't quite that. It's a bit more nuanced than that. But
rather than nuanced, I think if we can be clear.
Absolutely right. The fundamental point is that, that the starting point, at any rate, is that these consultations, ideally, according to the international standard, should be out of the hearing and preferably out of the eye line of the jailers or the detainees. And for the majority of the nursing staff who are female, that sometimes represents more of a risk than it does for the doctors.
Aren't doctors females?
We do have some female doctors, but they are in a greater minority. But the gender issue aside, there is a risk assessment which has to be made about that. And I don't think that that has been, as a principle, embedded into the culture of the way the custody nurse practitioners work. Because I hear plenty of occasions, anecdotally, of where custody nurse practitioners see detainees in the cell with jailers or other officers to hand. And that is not matching the standard which should be aimed at.
Okay, so that's hearsay. So can I go over now to the nurse and both? See, what I have a problem with is who's in charge of the nurses, whether it's you, Karen, or whether it's the superintendent or the commander. So who is accountable for nursing practice within this part of your service?
I am.
Right, and so you've heard what's been said, and if that's true, your nurses are in breach of their duty to give that confidentiality. Are you aware of this? Has it ever happened? And if it has, what have you done about it?
No, if I may answer from my perspective, the nurses who are employed by the Metropolitan Police have two parts to their confidentiality in terms of their work. One is their employee confidentiality, which is very different from their patient confidentiality. So, of course, there is no way the nurses are going to come out and discuss a case with an officer who happens to be in the corridor or anywhere else. But they may well want to inform the custody sergeants of the outcome of their assessment. In terms of their patient confidentiality, the consultations that the nurses undertake are generally done in the medical rooms. Now, there is a thorough risk assessment done by the custody sergeants before that assessment takes place. And the custody sergeant, in consultation with the nurse, will decide whether or not it's appropriate for the nurse to see that individual by themselves in the room. And often that is the case. There are some times where the individual there may be risk factors of violence or something else where the custody sergeant says, no, they need to be accompanied. Then there would be a detention officer allocated to accompany that individual to the medical room. But they would be stood outside and as far from earshot as is safe at that particular time.
Karen, can I just stop you there? If that assessment is made, then wouldn't that apply to a doctor as well?
Yes, it should do. We have had some instances before where a doctor has come unstuck with a detainee trying to get medication at the same time. So absolutely, it would apply to all healthcare professionals.
Right.
May I just say something about our patient confidentiality, because I would hate for that to be confusing in this forum. The nurses conduct their clinical assessment and write their contemporaneous clinical notes on a patient record system that we have within the Met. Currently, it's just being operated by nurses, but our medical director, Dr. Young, is very keen that that is now going to be adapted for all healthcare professionals, to include FMEs as well. So at the moment, the healthcare information for detainees is retained on a safe computer system which only other healthcare professionals can access. So, for example, my police colleagues couldn't access it, just myself and other nurses at the minute, but hopefully in the future myself and all the FMEs. And that's really to ensure the continuity of care, because, you know, in a world of you know, the detainees that we have are often very complex in their needs, and so it's really important that we know what's gone on before, or even, you know, a week ago when they attended custody. So that sharing of information within a health perspective is really, really important for us. And so it's not about breaching that confidentiality. There is still patient confidentiality, but that of course, is very different from their employee confidentiality.
Right. I'm a little bit more assured. I mean, I should declare that I've got many years of nursing behind me, and I'm also a patron of UCAFN. That's the nurses in forensic medicine.
Yes.
Now, and so that's why sort of my hair stood up when in terms of what I thought I'd heard. But it's made it much clearer, and I'll certainly look at the minutes. And if we need further clarification, I'll get back to you.
Of course.
Can I just stay with you, Karen, and say that we've heard about this difficulty in recruiting nurses now, and again. From my knowledge, there are loads of nurses who are unemployed who can be recruited, but it depends on the grade of the job, doesn't it, really? And
yes.
we've spoken about the shift system in our former session. So what is the grade that your nurses work at? And can you confirm, normally you would expect to find a clinical nurse specialist, which I'm not sure whether this is the same thing as whether we're talking parity with your custody nurse specialist. We normally find them at F and G grades.
Yes.
So what is the scale that they're paid on within the Metropolitan Police Service?
Well, they're on police staff grades, so they're on shadow bands. But if I could give you a sort of equivalent to the NHS, they would be a roughly equivalent band 6 within the NHS.
6, is that the old F or G? Or?
Yes, F.
F.
Just slightly below F.
Right.
And then we have area managers, which are on band V, which, in terms of F and G, they would essentially be G.
Right. So you said nearly F at 6. Is it more likely they're E at 5?
No. It's just where the pay scales, where there are perhaps 6 or 7 scales within a band, they don't fit exactly into the bands of the NHS. They're just slightly off.
Yeah. I mean, members might want to know that these fit with competencies that nurses would have acquired and are expected to have to be able to perform their duties, and that's what you work to. You are still working to the national nursing models.
Yes.
You haven't developed your own structure or ways of working.
No.
And your nurses are still accountable to the nursing body.
Yes.
All right. So then that leads me to a question, something you said. You said that the HMIC officers are coming in and making an assessment of nursing practice. What experience and expertise do HMIC officers have to do that?
Sorry, I didn't. If I said the word officers, I apologise. They are I'm not actually sure what their background is, but they are people who have previously inspected prison healthcare. So these are people who are very well versed in healthcare inspections, and that's why HMIC did it in a partnership with them, because they recognised that individually they didn't have that expertise within HMIC. So the comparator was made that prisons perhaps were the most comparable group to us, that they could seek that expertise from.
Okay, and just a little bit, we're talking about standards because that's key to actually being able to keep on reducing deaths in custody, and for the well-being of, it's not even deaths, that's the stream, it's about somebody who's been deprived their liberty and to make sure that their health and well-being is maintained, possibly improved, but certainly should not deteriorate in any way. So standards are key to that, and so I'm still not clear in terms of who is determining your nursing practice here, and maybe it's something that I need to find out, because it seems to me what the FMEs are saying is that they've got their faculty of forensic medicine who meet with HMIC, and therefore they can have some sort of dialogue about standards and what have you. What I don't understand is the dialogue between, say, HMIC, the College of Nursing, the Faculty of Forensic Medicine, and yourselves in that sort of professional grouping.
I can absolutely reassure you that is very much part of our practice in the Met. I've been very well supported by the Royal College of Nursing in terms of developing the clinical practice for the nurses, and indeed by the NMC. Both organisations have had quite a lot of input into our clinical practice over the years in terms of how we draw that together and how we progress and move forward. So we've always had a very close dialogue with them in terms of what is correct, how we can expand practice and how we develop moving forward.
Okay, so it's a challenging environment, and most workplaces are, and you've got the right grade, and you've got the right sort of professional structure and clinical governance. So why are you still not able to recruit staff? Because you've got just about a third of your vacancies. I mean, why is that?
I think we have looked at this process on a number of occasions, and we have tried to identify areas where we can improve, and even indeed at the moment some of the things that we're doing, our marketing and attractions team are looking at some research to try and give us a flavour of perhaps why nurses who may be interested in the role then don't go on to apply. So that's something that we're very keen to try and get. The other things we're looking at is the ways that we actually recruit. So our marketing people, our teams are now looking at more internet-based searching. We're doing some open days where we invite nurses to come in so that we can actually demonstrate to them on a very practical level what the role is. We can talk with them on a one-to-one, quite informally, about how we operate within the Met, and we can give them some guidance about the application procedure, which is different for them, certainly for those that have come from an NHS background. So we find that giving those opportunities has helped, but it certainly hasn't fixed it.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that has given us a good broad understanding, and I've got a question for Alison about the day-to-day work as a nurse in a custody suite. I noticed that Dr. Green was trying to attract my attention.
If I may, very briefly, your own organisation, the United Kingdom Association of Forensic Nurses, I think you said you were
I'm patron.
A patron. Right.
Yeah.
My faculty actually has set up quality standards for nurses and paramedics in general forensic medicine, and those are the ones which one would expect the nursing fraternity to work to, and your organisation, madam, was part of that discussion. The second thing about I'm not entirely sure that the issue around nursing, if I may be so bold to comment on the point, is just about recruitment. It's about retention too. We have somewhere between 60 and 70 nurses currently in place, and there are roughly the same number about 15 months ago. But nearly half of those nurses who were in post just over a year ago have now left, which is a large churn factor by anybody's standards. And I think that is a really important thing. I think it's good that efforts are being made, because I, like the rest of my colleagues, are a great supporter of the team approach to healthcare. It does bring benefits when it works properly, but it doesn't at the moment. And I think one of the issues is that the nurses are leaving not quite as fast they're being recruited, but something quite close to it, and I think that's bothersome.
I think we were hoping to get a first-hand account from Alison. So thank you for leading us into that. And Commander, I do know that you were trying to get in, so if I can just bring Alison in here, because Alison, can you talk us through your experience, you know, the good ones and the bad ones, and then can you just address this, you know, high turnover within your service? Have you got any insights on that?
So that's with the clarification as to what you can do and what a doctor can do as well, which hasn't yet been covered. Thank you.
Okay, if you deal with my questions and then we'll come back.
Yeah, but it's the same question, it's part of the same.
Yeah.
I understood it was going to be covered by you.
Yeah.
I can only speak for myself, my own experience. I was a nurse in the Metropolitan Police 4 years ago. I think custody nursing is a great opportunity for nurses. I think it is a great opportunity for the health of a very vulnerable population. I really enjoyed the job. I had no concerns or no issues with the way that police or detention officers dealt with, or the care and safety and well-being of detainees. I had concerns, professional concerns, over training and education and learning and assessing in practice, over record keeping, which sounds as though it's now been addressed, and over some procedures, for example, venipuncture, and which at the time that I resigned were for me unresolved. So that's about the... I really did enjoy my time. I really do think it's a great opportunity, but you know, sadly these concerns were unresolved, and so I resigned.
That was 4 years ago.
It was 4 years ago. It was beginning. I joined in 2009 and I left in 2010. Yeah, 4 years ago.
Well, we've taken note of that, and if not today, what we can ask for is an assurance that those issues have been addressed. And but in terms of the standard and your own professional practice, did you at any time feel that compromised because of your working relationships with custody officers?
As you know, every nurse is accountable for acts and omissions and their own practice. I was aware that I'm employed by the Metropolitan Police, but I maintain my independence from them. Always made that perfectly clear to detained persons. I never had any problems whatsoever. There was no clash of cultures at all. I worked very happily in cooperation with a number of other professionals, Metropolitan Police officers, the doctors, the mental health workers, the substance misuse, the homeless team, social workers. No, I never felt at all that my own professional standards were compromised.
And as my colleague Victoria said, it would just help us if we could just get an assurance from you that there is a clarity between the roles of the FME and the role of the CNSs. Do you have that understanding of the clarity, or are there grey areas or areas of overlap that could be of concern?
I can only speak to my own personal practice. For me, it was extremely clear when I had exhausted my professional remit, then I would call upon my doctor colleagues. So for me, it was absolutely clear.
Okay. And can I just stay with you and say, we've heard about this assessment that's made quite properly by the custody officer, and the risk assessment that's been made, and that's made for everyone, isn't it? That's the start of the process, is it?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, but we can get that from the police.
Yeah.
But did you have any concerns about that area of the risk assessment?
None whatsoever. I think the custody officers are excellent assessors.
Right.
So much experience.
Okay. Thank you for that. No, my colleague may have just a follow-up question for you, Alison. Can I now come to Commander Hanstock, and you were trying to attract my attention.
It was just 2 points, and I was going to invite Karen to just give that clarity around nurses and doctors in terms of what they do. The point I would make is, from our assessment, 85% of the occasions where custody detainees are seen by a nurse, they need no further ongoing referral, which sort of gives us some confidence that that assessment and evaluation of their situation is very well catered for by the nursing practitioners. Karen, I don't know if you want to make any more of the distinction other than what's already been described.
Yes, now I've got a question for Karen, because she spoke about the medical director. So if we were to look at your service then, in charge of your service is the medical director?
No, in charge of our service is the custody police officers above. So Annette here on my left is direct line manager for both myself and the medical director. So within the structure that we have a forensic healthcare services unit, which is led by a chief inspector and a team of support staff and administration staff. And my colleague, Dr. Oyong, manages the FME clinical practice, and myself the same for the nurses. We have some differences in processes because the medical director's workforce, if you like, or contracted, and the nursing staff are directly employed. But overall, we have responsibility for those two separate groups, but we work very closely together. So, for example, all our clinical governance strands, like our medicines management, our clinical practice and performance groups, our risk management panels, all of those boards that we have within the MEP structure are attended by both of us. And we very much work in partnership now in trying to bring any good practice together so that we can share it across all healthcare.
Okay. Can you just tell us briefly what professional qualifications do nurses in this area of speciality need? Do they need a specialist qualification or?
No, they are general nurses, and the groups that we recruit from in the majority are from A&E backgrounds or the prison service. We do have a number of nurses who come from a variety of areas, so primary care, surgical placements, quite a range really that are attracted to this role. But I would say A&E and the prisons are the two that we seem to attract from most.
We've been given some comments from a former custody nurse, and she said her training was a 5-week course, and that it was teaching done via PowerPoint with very little practical instructions. Is that still the case, and is that really appropriate?
No, that wouldn't be appropriate. I'm not aware that that's the case. We do have a 5-week training programme. 3 weeks is delivered by the Met Police family, so that entails all the information that they need to know about working specifically for the Met. So that would include our own diversity package, roles of the custody teams, how interviews are conducted, all of the sort of police-related work. And then the final 2 weeks are very much clinical-based. And so they look at clinical conditions or injuries that they would deal with, quite possibly in other areas of their practice, but we demonstrate how those are dealt with differently in this environment, because that's the big culture difference, I think, for nurses, is the environment change from what they're used to practicing within.
Okay, Karen, but you've heard Alison said that 4 years ago she left the service, and one of the reasons was that, and I'll quote here, that some of the practices she was asked to carry out were unsafe, and despite reporting to the head of nursing, her complaints weren't acted on. So there were a number of areas to do with training and everything. Are those issues still the same, or what has happened over the last 4 years?
I think, to be honest, in this forum it would probably be unprofessional of me to comment on Alison's specific case. But I think, there were matters that Alison didn't feel were compatible with her practice. And despite our very best efforts in the Met to reassure her of those, along with our colleagues in the NMC and the RCN, unfortunately that wasn't the case. And as Alison says, unfortunately she resigned.
Okay, I need to stay with this. The practices that a nurse identified as being unsafe, were they investigated?
Absolutely.
And are you saying that those practices then fall into this sort of guidance that ACPO set? I don't know how they do that, but ACPO set it, and they fall into nursing practice?
No, they were absolutely explored to actually the highest level within the Met. And we had documented assurance from, I think at the time it was one of the assistant commissioners, about the practice in terms of indemnity. But basically, the computer system that Mr. Hanstock has referred to earlier as the NSPIS system is not an ideal system. And it wasn't built for healthcare, and it wasn't a sustainable long term for the developments in healthcare that we would want it to have been able to do. But we had to work within the realms of what we had, and in order to do that safely, we took the guidance from places like the NMC and the RCN as to how we could do that. So those reassurances were given, but despite all the other nurses, other than one, not using it, that was Alison's choice to leave.
Yeah. But and why I'm going to come back to Alison because she brought this up, and it's her experience. But it's not just Alison, because as we have the figures in front of us, your turnover, your retention level is poor. So have you investigated that? And is that when exit interviews are done, when you're able to capture that information, if not you, then the service, when standard issues have been raised, have these been investigated, and have you put in the appropriate actions or mitigations? If you start, and then if we can receive some assurance from the MPS, that would be useful, and then I'll finish with Alison just coming back.
Certainly. Yes, we're absolutely aware of our churn rate, and it's something that we've done quite a lot recently to try and address, but we are cognizant that the initial planning around Herald may have been a little bit idealistic in terms of what our retention would be. I think nursing as a profession is quite a transient profession, so people will move from different posts to gain different experience in other areas. And I think within the NHS structure there is that ability to progress, whereas our own service may seem quite flat because there aren't the progression of roles up a rank structure. So we know that that's a frustration for some nurses that come in who have worked with us and then want to progress up a level or up a grade and aren't able to do that.
Okay. I'm not being convinced here. It's not what you're saying. I think maybe let me ask the service and put it to them this way. A sign of an unhealthy environment, one of the signs is that people don't stay, they leave. And you can also look at the time that they're leaving in. I don't accept that it's normal to find in any profession a churn of 50 staff out of 69. I don't know what sort of percentage that is. I'm like Michael Gove, mathematically challenged, but it is an extraordinary percentage. When you have looked at your data, can you tell us the top 3 reasons why people are leaving this area?
I'll bring Annette in to talk about some of that trend analysis from exit interviews.
Yeah.
But it's important to state, custody is a challenging and unpredictable environment.
We've heard that.
It's
we
not
accept that.
a place that is lending to that kind. But the question I think you're asking is, are people leaving because of poor practice, poor support, poor training? We create an environment that's not attractive for nurses. I think that's where you're getting to with this. Annette has a greater understanding of the trends from those exit interviews, and I think you're asking for 3 reasons. Annette,
well, no, the top 3 would help us, but we'll come back to you and see that evidence. But just share with us the top 3 so that we can get an idea.
I mean, there are a range. There's no one specific issue that people identify as the fact that it's made them leave. There are a range, and I mean, Karen has already mentioned them. We don't have real extensive promotion opportunities for nurses. We only have 8 area managers, and that would be the progression that nurses could do within the MPS. They can't move over to be in our occupational health, for example, which is the only other area where we have nurses. So that's one issue. We found on some of the exit interviews that the autonomy of the role wasn't something that our nurse colleagues actually enjoyed. The fact that they are the only medical expert within a team, whereas when they work within the NHS environment, they're surrounded by other medical experts. And despite us making it very clear in the recruitment and marketing packages and our open days when we try and attract people to come into the organisation, we do make it absolutely clear that they are the medical expert within the custody team. And some of the responses in terms of exit interviews have been that they didn't actually like being that exposed. So that was one of the other reasons. So, Karen, I don't think there's any...
Okay. Yeah, I think the only one to follow up really would have been the previous system that we ran meant that the nurses moved quite a lot to cover or backfill somewhere else. So on the 1st of April, we introduced a new rota system, which was a much more fixed rota system and placements to try and give them that much more stability rather than transferring from one to the other. So we know that movement is something that is very, very unpopular. So moving forward, that's something that we are now looking at to try and concentrate the numbers where we have existing services so that mobility doesn't happen. So we've created a rota that they're much happier with now, and that was done in consultation with all of the nurses. And we're hoping that will give them that bit more stability.
Okay, thank you. Alison, I'm so short of time, but I'd like you to come back because you raised the issues quite rightly about your concerns 4 years ago. From what you've heard, do you get a sense that the issues that you identified 4 years ago have been addressed?
In one case, yes. In 2 others, no.
And those 2 others would be?
Venipuncture and the training of nurses.
So that's the training, and that was venipuncture is a particular procedure.
Yes.
Right. And so are you able to quickly just answer to say you've dealt with that particular area?
Absolutely. It's now a criteria for nurses coming into the Met that they have previous experience of venipuncture. Whilst that is part of our training, and they will undertake training for venipuncture in the clinical elements, the practice that's undertaken within police custody is different from what would be in mainstream healthcare. So, for example, the Road Traffic Act, the primary legislation, determines that samples for traffic offences have to be from one sample. So that means that we can't use vacutainers that most nurses would be familiar with. and it's sort of taken a step back almost to using needles and syringes, albeit our medical directors work very hard to bring in something called safe sharps now, but they're not ideal, and they are sort of going back a step, for example. So it's very difficult for us as an organisation to find nurses extra placements anywhere else which would accommodate that type of practice. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, because of that restriction in the law, where we've had nurses coming in who previously couldn't take blood, we've had to have a very long process for them of supervision with either their manager to help them through the competency process, or in some cases they'll watch an FME and be supervised in that way. So we've tried to design out that risk, if you like, by making sure at the very outset nurses are familiar with the process.
Thank you, Karen. And as I said, I'm going to make it my duty to go through the minutes and see what other questions come to me, and I
yes, of course.
That you would be, and I think I'm going to have to do that with you as well, Annette, because I know that Dr. Payne-James was trying to attract my attention.
That's a very quick question.
Can I just hear what Dr. Payne-James has to say, and then I'll hand over to you.
I think a general point to be made is that the nurses and the doctors at practice level have been kept very separate in the last 4 or 5 years. I do find it very difficult to understand that after 4 years that there is so little information as to why there is a high churn rate. Certainly anecdotally, and we have to go on anecdote because there doesn't seem to be any hard data which is readily available, were the proper research done, to establish why people are leaving. There are certain things that certainly as a medic I've experienced is that within the Met, for example, there can be a pressure or a sense of coercion and pressure that if you don't do something or you do something, that will be better for you in terms of the work that you get or where you will be working. I think it's important to understand that. There is a Met culture. From the point of view of training, I'm still concerned that what you have is, I won't use the term a two-tier system, but there is a two-skill system whereby if you are arrested for whatever reason, dependent on where you are arrested, you will get a different type of health care, if not a different level of health care. And that is something that I think that it has been disappointing for those of us who want to work in a multi-professional environment. I talk, I speak, I work commonly. This week, I've been in touch with 4 or 5 nurses working in different areas, seeking advice or whatever. My feeling overall is that there is a higher level whereby it's not wanted that doctors and nurses work together as we would in any other setting. And that is a sense, it's an anecdotal, personal view I'm happy to have challenged, but that's a sense that I'd like to put forward.
Happy to respond to that challenge then.
Before you respond, can I just say, can we get a sense of the turnover level? My understanding, it doesn't turn over that fast with FMEs working in that similar environment.
What happens is there's been a gradual reduction in FMEs. People do work for 2 main reasons. 1, because they enjoy it. 2, because they earn an income. What's happened is that over the last few years, the majority of FMEs doing the work now are doing it because we enjoy the challenging circumstances of working with vulnerable people in custody. It's what medicine is all about. I think it's fair to say, and again I'm happy to be challenged on this, that the churn rate of FMEs is not. It's a gradual erosion of people feeling, because of pressures, because of better opportunities elsewhere, that they won't do it. So I don't think we have the same kind of churn rate. The way in which our work is allotted is different. So I think there is difficulties in recruiting simply because of the nature of the work and the circumstance in which work is done. But we don't have a churn rate. I think again, happy to be corrected on this as ever, that those who are doing the work, and perhaps many like me who've been doing it for perhaps a couple of decades or so, and then a younger tranche who are doing it, have been doing it for several years. And I know there's been great attempts to try and recruit more.
I'm aware of the time, but Adrian, you have
Thank
to
you,
come
Chair.
back, yeah.
Because I don't want to challenge at all on churn, because there's a whole range of reasons why that may be the case and the attractiveness of the post. What I do want to challenge, though, quite strongly is the suggestion that this coercion of medical practitioners to behave in any way other than within the expectation of their role and ethical standards. And if I see examples of that, then I'll be prepared for this panel to consider them. But I think it's abhorrent somebody suggests that the police service would influence and insist on medical practitioners behaving in a way other than under the codes of their own professional practice.
Does that, can I just say, does that apply to nursing
That
professionals?
applies to all healthcare professionals that are supporting us safely manage detainees and people in our care.
Okay.
And if a medical practitioner had a concern,
There
how
are-
would they deal with it with you?
Absolutely. There are well-established escalation processes for concerns along this line, as Alison has already explored with the Met, and as Karen has described, have been examined at the highest levels. And I can't make that more strongly.
Okay. So perhaps what would be sensible is for you to listen to concerns and, in your listening mode, perhaps, command it. But can I just come back to the question that Victoria asked originally? Just what's the difference between the procedures that, or when is a FME called in where a nurse cannot
I think also we were also a
exercise?
bit shocked, and I can't understand why the police don't follow the usual NHS guidelines as well. Why isn't current practice in the NHS the same? I mean, it's back to one of the original points I made right at the very beginning on consistency. So it's the same problem.
I think Karen highlighted the Road Traffic Act, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the majority of the role is very similar, and that's not to say that the two professions are similar. That's to say that actually there is a cut-off point of safety in a custody environment where it becomes unsafe for the detainee to remain in custody. So, that's why we're saying the majority of the consultations that the nurse carries out will be done by themselves without
Could you just
referring
give us
to
some
anyone else.
flavour of what those are? Because
There's only two specific areas in legislation where a doctor has to perform the consultation, and that is for taking road traffic bloods in a hospital, and also that's under the Road Traffic Act, so that primary legislation dictates that practice.
But if it was taken in a hospital, would it be taken under hospital practices or under your practices?
No, it's taken, but the FMEs would attend a hospital to take a forensic sample under the Road Traffic Act. Our nurses are not allowed to attend hospital to do that same procedure.
And so that's not in the custody suite anyway.
No, but it's one of the differences between the two roles. And the other one within the Met Police is the care and sampling of those persons detained under the Terrorism Act.
Fine. So everything else can be carried out by a nurse.
Yes, but as Alison says, there are each individual case, will be different because every case is different. And as Alison says, if a nurse gets to a point where they think that consultation exceeds their clinical practice, then they would refer to an FME, or it may be that it's because the scope within the patient group directions, which are the enablers for nurses to administer medications, don't exceed to what that individual needs. So they may call upon an FME to prescribe something else or something more extensive for that individual.
And I think next month we'll be looking at mental health, because I think that's another cause of concern that has been expressed.
But this is different, obviously. This is RTAs.
Given our time, I think we must move on. But can I just clear up one thing? Where there, can you tell us what the response time is for nurses where they are not permanently based in the 24-hour nurse-covered custody suites?
They are. When they're on duty, they are within that one custody suite.
So you don't have them moving to somewhere else?
We have one team that moves, and that's a mobile team between Bethnal Green and Limehouse, and the journey between those is about 20 minutes. So that's mobility between those two areas, who wouldn't be big enough or essentially have the detainee throughput to justify their own team. That arrangement works very well. But in those other areas where we've mentioned 24/7 staff, and those areas where they're not 24/7, the non-24/7 staff areas are those in which we have not reduced the FME teams. So they are in addition to the FME teams, but when they're on duty, they are within the custody suite. Okay. So they're available there and then.
I'm going to give Dr. Green a quick point, then I'm going to move on to the next our last set of questions. Dr. Green.
In the spirit of candour, and from somebody who you can tell from looking at my hair, I'm not for churning. There's a real concern about taking nurses who have significant levels of competence, but subjecting them so simply in clinical terms a 2-week course to upskill them to the sorts of things which they're required to do, injury interpretation, the complex cases that we have to deal with. I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't express that concern. Secondly, given the lack of data that we have about the churn rate and the departure rate, I can support what my friend and colleague has said about the anecdotal reasons why nurses are leaving, which is that the lack of training and a sense of lack of support as well. Because I think I hear what Karen says about there's a difference between the way things work in the NHS, but if you're part of a team, even if you're a solitary worker, it should be possible to make that work, and it doesn't at the moment, I think, for a considerable number of healthcare practitioners. And lastly, the whole elephant in the room about mental health and fitness to be interviewed in those circumstances is a big area and criteria, which I think needs to be focused. I'm glad to hear you're taking that on.
We've got a session next month.
I think that's right. One final point, while I have your attention, Chair, if I may, is that the introduction of electronic recording, electronic note-making, which is, I think, being discussed at the moment in the Met for the FMEs, needs to be compliant with the CPT standard, which I started my comment to you about, and I'm not sure that what's proposed at the moment does that. I'm not sure that the faculty would support it either.
Karen was nodding at that point. Is it going to be compliant?
Yes, our medical director is leading on that, so I'm sure he'll incorporate all of those.
He is a member of the faculty as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to move now to just the future management and oversight, just to finish this section off. And that's it's anticipated, I understand, that custodial healthcare will transfer to the NHS by 2015. And what we had in advance of this was an email from Dr. Wilkes at the BMA, who's stated to us that at the moment the only UK police force that has not committed to this change is the MPS, and suggests that we may want to examine why you remain undecided or opposed to a move that will have the potential to reduce current risks to detainees. So can I just ask, is that correct, that the MPS is the only one not signed up to NHS commissioning in the future?
Partially, in that we're not currently engaged with the exploratory pilot, but since the agreement at Management Board for the new single detention model, we have agreed now that we will work with NHS on their exploration of what the best healthcare provision for custody in London should look like. Now, whether that ultimately results in the NHS receiving the commission for that work is for further consideration by the commission, our commissioner, to see where that service can be best provided. Or indeed, if our internal provision is in fact sufficient itself with the expansion and growth that we would like. So the short answer is we hadn't been involved up until this time because of the changes to our detention profile. Now we've agreed that, we are working with NHS and I have a meeting next week with the Director of NHS London to look at how we start that process of understanding what healthcare in custody in London ought to look like.
Given the past difficulties you've had, it would seem sensible to progress those conversations quickly, I would suggest. But can I just seek an assurance from you that whether you commission from the NHS or not, your priority will be a quality of healthcare service, and it will be the quality of the healthcare service provided, and not about cost.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the priority now, and I think it's been said in a number of our sessions in the earlier part of this. The quality of care is the overriding element here. And it's you know, that, well, there's nothing more I can add to that. It is about quality of care here. You know, we didn't have the best position before because we simply had custody officers making their best guess judgment of whether this person needs to go to hospital or not, or whether they need to call an FME or not. That was the quality of care assessment. We've moved on from that significantly. Our ambition is to put that straight away from the outset in the hands of those who are qualified to make those assessments.
Okay, and can I turn then to MOPAC? Marie, what's your oversight going to be of this process? Because it's sensitive to me that up to date the police haven't really shown that they necessarily are the best providers of healthcare in custody.
So I think there's sort of two elements from MOPAC's in terms of involvement going forward on the oversight side. Of course, the continued delivery of ICV within in terms of that improving that healthcare kind of here and now, and indeed understanding any issues coming out will continue to operate and happen. So we have oversight operating at that local level. At the strategic level, as Commander Hanstock described, we are also part of those discussions with NHS England about the future commissioning, and of course because of their role in terms of commissioning in terms of criminal justice, we are absolutely working with the MPS and with NHS England to work out what that best model looks like, as Commander Hanstock. But it's early days and the conversations are just commencing.
Because as I understand it, the only part in the criminal justice system, healthcare, that is not provided by the NHS is custody at police stations. So it would seem that that might be the sensible place to go to. But Marie, I assume that you'll be the director in charge of recommending whether or not a contract is signed to the Deputy Mayor. So can I just have your assurance as well that your major priority will be about the healthcare to detainees?
Absolutely, and also in the context of obviously wider offender health, and it's obviously interesting and timely in terms of your focus on mental health at the next session, because I think in terms of our work, I think as Commander Hanstock was saying earlier, it isn't just about within the custody environment, it's about actually all of the pathways and how we're actually tackling that, working with NHS England and indeed working with the MPS on that. So yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And can I just thank you all for attending today? As my colleague has said, we may have some questions, we can come back to you. But also, if you also think we've missed something, or we didn't give you the opportunity to say all that you wanted to say, we're more than happy to receive any feedback after this meeting.
We said we'd like to talk to you for 3 days, Madam Chair.
But can I thank you all for attending? Sometimes it was challenging, but I think it was very useful, so thank you very much. And committee members, can I just ask your indulgence? Can we just note the report in our discussion today? And can we note our response to the Home Office's consultation on stop and search? And can we note our response to MOPAC's consultation on violence against women and girls strategy? Agreed. And can we note our report on safer neighbourhood boards? Agreed. And note our report on monitoring the police and crime priorities and the information attached to our agenda? Agreed. And can you note any outstanding, ongoing or completed actions arising from our previous meetings? Agreed. And can we note the work programme set out in our report? Agreed. And can we just note that the next meeting is on the 24th of October at 2 o'clock, and I have no urgent business. So thank you all. Thank you.
This is City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and the London Assembly. This channel carries coverage of public proceedings of the Mayor and the London Assembly. This is City Hall, the home of London's democracy. This is